There's a document sitting inside the official records of the British monarchy right now that rewrites something this family has not touched in over 70 years. Prince Edward signed it, and the moment it was finalized, two people inside that palace went completely white. Now, the palace has spent the last several weeks saying almost nothing about it, which is the first thing that tells you it matters, because when something genuinely does not matter, they say so. They put out a line, a sentence, a phrase about continuity and tradition and the institution's commitment to serving the public, and everybody moves on. That is not what happened here. What happened here was silence. The specific, careful, load-bearing kind of silence that building only produces when it has decided that the less said, the better. And here's the thing about that silence. It did not hold. It never holds. Because there were people in that room when the pen went down and the document was done. And people who were in rooms like that do not stay quiet forever, especially when what they witnessed was the kind of moment that only arrives once in a generation inside an institution this old. What happened in the moments after Edward signed has not been reported anywhere. Not in the broadsheets, not in the royal correspondence columns, not in the careful reconstructions that appear in the Sunday papers 3 weeks after the fact. I have been through all of it. The detail I am going to give you tonight came from a different direction entirely, and it changes the way you read everything the palace has said and not said since. Because the part that stunned the country is not actually the document. The part that stunned the country is what Edward said when it was done. 5 words spoken quietly to one person in a room with no cameras and no press office within a mile of it. Stay with me to the end, because that is where this lands. Quick word before we go further. I am Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family. The records, the official filings, the reporting that got buried before anybody finished asking questions. What you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them, not a palace press release. And I want to be honest with you the way I always am at the start of these. Some of what follows is documented, publicly confirmed, and sitting in the official record. Some of it comes from sources close to the household who have spoken to journalists over the past several months. And I will tell you which is which as we go, because the people who blur that line are selling you something. I am not. Stay to the end, because the last piece of this story is the one that reframes everything before it. Now, to understand why what Edward just did matters, you have to understand something about this man that most people have never bothered to find out. And that is understandable, because for the better part of 4 decades, the palace itself did not seem particularly interested in Edward either. He is the youngest of 4, and in a family where birth order is not merely a social detail but a constitutional fact, that position has defined almost everything about his adult life. Charles was always the heir. Anne was always the one who worked hardest and minded least about the credit. Andrew was the one who flew helicopters into the Falklands and came home a hero before he became something else entirely. And Edward was the one left over. That is not a cruel assessment. It is the institutional reality that he grew up inside, and he has spent 60 years navigating it with varying degrees of success and a great deal more dignity than he is usually given credit for. He was born in 1964, the 4th child of Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. By the time he was old enough to understand what his family was, the roles had already been allocated. He was educated at Gordonstoun, the same school that had already processed his father and his brother Charles, a place that has been described by everyone who attended it with a particular mix of respect and quiet horror. He went to Cambridge. He studied history. And then he did the thing that shaped public perception of him for the next 30 years in a single afternoon. In 1987, he quit the Royal Marines. He had enrolled in the training program, as his father had served, as Andrew had served, and he lasted 4 months before he resigned. The palace tried to manage it. The press did not cooperate. His father reportedly did not speak to him properly for weeks, and the headline that followed Edward around for the better part of a decade was not one that anybody in that family would have chosen. He was soft. He could not hack it. He was the one who gave up. Now I want to put something next to that narrative before we go any further, because it has been used to diminish this man for so long that people have stopped questioning whether it is fair. Quitting something that is wrong for you is not the same as failing at something you were capable of. Edward walked away from a path his family had laid out for him because it was not his path. He knew it at 22, and he said so. And in a family that runs almost entirely on performing the expected thing, regardless of what it costs you, that decision took a kind of honesty that his institution does not traditionally reward. What it got him instead was 20 years of tabloid condescension and a series of professional missteps that the press covered with a relish that was never quite applied to his siblings at their worst moments. He went into television production. The company struggled. He organized a charity event called It's a Royal Knockout in 1987 that became a shorthand for royal embarrassment for the better part of a generation. Senior palace figures watched it and winced and said nothing to his face. His mother was quietly furious. His father was loudly furious, which for Philip was actually easier to survive than the alternative. And through all of it, Edward kept his face still. He did not rage at the press. He did not give the interviews that would have let him explain himself. He absorbed it the way the institution teaches you to absorb things, which is in silence. And he waited. He has always been waiting. And that patience, which everyone around him mistook for passivity, turns out to have been something else entirely. Before we get to the document, you need to understand one other thing about Edward's position inside this family, and it has a name. The name is Sophie. Sophie Rhys-Jones married Edward in June of 1999, and the coverage at the time was warm without being particularly perceptive. A commoner, a public relations professional, pleasant, photogenic, suitable. The press approved of her in the moderate, vaguely surprised way the press approves of things it was not expecting to like. And then it mostly moved on because there was always something louder happening somewhere else in that family, and Sophie was never the source of the loud thing. That was, it turns out, the whole point of her. Sophie understood from the moment she married into that family that the way to survive it was not to fight it and not to perform it, but to serve it so quietly and so consistently that the institution itself would eventually recognize what it had. She took on patronages nobody else wanted. She sat through engagements in drafty village halls in the north of England on wet Tuesday afternoons, with the same focus she brought to state occasions. She visited conflict zones. She has done more work on preventing avoidable blindness across sub-Saharan Africa than almost any other royal in the modern era. And most people could not tell you that without looking it up, because Sophie has never once done it for the attention. Queen Elizabeth noticed. That is the most important sentence in Sophie's entire royal biography, and it does not get written often enough. In the last decade of her reign, Elizabeth trusted Sophie in a way she trusted very few people connected to that family by marriage rather than by blood. When Philip was dying, it was Sophie who sat with her. Not Charles, not Anne. Sophie. She drove herself to Windsor, and she sat with the Queen through some of the worst hours of Elizabeth's long life. And she did not tell anybody she was going, and she did not talk about it afterwards. That is who Edward married, and it changed his position inside the family in ways that the public record only partially reflects. By the time Charles came to the throne in September of 2022, Sophie had already become one of the most trusted operational figures in the senior royal circle. Her judgment was sought. Her read on situations was valued. And the woman who had been introduced to the public as pleasant and photogenic turned out to be, by every internal account, one of the sharpest political minds in the building. Edward's stock rose with hers, not because he was riding her reputation, but because the institution began to see him the way she had always seen him, steadier than he looked, more capable than the Royal Marines story had suggested. A man who had spent 30 years learning the institution from the inside without any of the pressure that comes from being the heir. Charles saw it, and what he decided to do about it is where this story actually begins. In March of 2023, King Charles III confirmed that Prince Edward would inherit the title Duke of Edinburgh. Philip had held it since 1947. Charles had held it briefly before he became heir apparent, and it had sat, formally unused, since Philip's death in April of 2021. The decision to pass it to Edward rather than allowing it to expire or be reassigned was not automatic. It required a deliberate royal warrant. It required Charles to actively choose it, and the choice was reported at the time as a sentimental gesture, a tribute to Philip, a tidy piece of institutional housekeeping. Most of the coverage filed it under sweet and moved on. That reading missed almost everything about what was actually happening. The Duke of Edinburgh title is not decorative. It has never been decorative. In the history of the British monarchy, the title has been held by men who sat at the absolute center of the institution's operational gravity. Philip held it for 73 years and spent every one of them as the person the Queen trusted above every other human being on earth, not merely as a husband, but as a counsel, a strategist, a blunt instrument when one was needed, and a steady hand when steadiness was the harder ask. The title carries that history inside it. Conferring it on someone is not a formality. It is a statement about how the reigning monarch sees that person's role in the institution going forward. And Charles did not stop there, because alongside the title came something that has received almost no coverage at all, and that is the detail that changes the entire shape of this story. Edward was formally repositioned in the working structure of the royal household in a way that expanded his constitutional responsibilities beyond anything he had previously held. Patronages were transferred. Official representational duties that had previously sat with other members of the family were reallocated to Edward's office. His household staff was quietly increased, and his access to senior briefing documents, the internal communications that tell you where the real power in that institution operates, was upgraded in a way that had not happened since Sophie sat with the dying queen, and Elizabeth decided this couple was something the monarchy needed to hold on to. None of this was announced in a single press release. It happened the way the important things always happen inside those walls, in pieces, one adjustment at a time. Small enough that objecting to any individual change makes you look unreasonable, large enough that by the time you stand back and look at the whole picture, something fundamental has shifted, and you cannot put your finger on the exact moment it moved. Now I need to take you somewhere most of the coverage of this story has not gone, because this is the part that reframes everything that came before it. In the autumn of 2024, a specific legal and constitutional question was put to senior palace advisors by the King's office. The question concerned the formal documentation surrounding the line of succession and the rights, responsibilities, and entitlements that attach to the individuals named within it. In particular, it concerned the position of those royal family members who exist outside the direct line of inheritance, but who carry working titles and operational duties on behalf of the crown. The question was not abstract. It was pointed directly at Edward's position and at a gap in the formal record that had existed, quietly and without resolution, since the legal adjustments made to the succession framework in the years following the 1999 Act that reformed the hereditary peerage. What the advisors found when they looked at it properly was the kind of thing that makes constitutional lawyers go very still. There was an inconsistency, not a crisis, not a scandal, but a genuine structural ambiguity in how Edward's role and entitlements were documented relative to his actual operational position inside the palace, and that ambiguity mattered for a specific reason that nobody inside the building wanted to say out loud directly. Because Charles is ill. His treatment is ongoing. His working capacity has been carefully managed for the better part of 2 years, and in that context, the formal documentation of who does what and under what authority is not a piece of administrative tidiness. It is the load-bearing wall of the whole structure. Charles wanted it resolved, and he wanted it resolved in a way that reflected the reality of what Edward had become inside the institution rather than the assumption most people were still operating on, which was the assumption built on a story about a young man quitting a military training program in 1987 and never quite recovering. The document that resulted from that review is not something you will find summarized neatly in a press release, because the palace did not issue one. What it does is formally codify Edward's operational standing within the constitutional framework in a way that has direct implications for the line of succession, not by moving his position within it, which is fixed by statute and cannot be changed by royal warrant, but by clarifying and in certain specific areas, expanding the formal powers that attach to his role as a senior working royal. Let me explain why that distinction matters, because it is the detail that most of the headlines got wrong. The line of succession itself, the ranked order of who inherits the throne if the monarch dies, is governed by the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013, which reformed the previous framework and cannot be altered by anything short of primary legislation agreed across every realm that recognizes the British monarch as head of state. Edward is currently 14th in line. That number has not changed. It is not going to change because of anything in this document. What the document does is something different, and in some ways more significant. It formally establishes Edward as a counselor of state with an expanded operational brief. If you have not come across that term before, a counselor of state is the mechanism by which the British Constitution allows certain senior royals to carry out the duties of the monarch when the monarch is incapacitated, abroad, or otherwise unable to act. There are a fixed number of them. The Regency Acts govern who qualifies, and the specific powers they can exercise on behalf of the Crown have traditionally been interpreted in a narrow and conservative way. What this document does is sit alongside that existing framework and formally document the scope of Edward's responsibilities in a way that pushes the operational boundary of his role further than it has been pushed for any non-direct heir royal since the mid-20th century. Senior constitutional advisors have described it, carefully and in private, as without modern precedent for someone at his position in the family. One person who has seen the full document told a journalist connected to two of the publications that broke this story that reading it felt like watching the palace quietly acknowledge something it had been reluctant to put on paper for years, that Edward is not the fourth child anymore. He is the working spine of a slimmed-down monarchy that needs him in a way it never expected to. Now I want to take you to Charles, because you cannot understand this decision without understanding the man who made it and what it cost him personally to make it. Charles spent decades as the heir, longer than any heir in the history of the British monarchy. He waited 50 years for a throne that was always his, and the waiting shaped him in ways that the public record only partially captures. He understands, in the bone-deep way that only someone who has stood in that particular position can understand. What it means to be the person the institution needs but has not yet formally acknowledged. He watched his own mother navigate the question of operational authority versus formal title for the entirety of her reign. He watched Philip manage the specific frustration of being essential without being official. And he came to the throne with a clearer view of that problem than any of his predecessors because he had been studying it from the inside for half a century. His decision to pass the Edinburgh title to Edward was not sentiment. It was strategy, and the document that followed is the proof of it. What Charles has been building quietly, and with the kind of patience that serious illness tends to accelerate, is an answer to a question the monarchy has been avoiding since it became clear in early 2024 that his treatment was going to be longer and more limiting than the first public statement had suggested. The question is this: if the monarch cannot be in every room, who is? If the direct heir is focused on preparing for the throne rather than running the day-to-day machinery of the institution, who keeps the machinery moving? The answer Charles has landed on is Edward, and the document formalizing that answer is the most significant piece of internal constitutional work this family has produced in a generation. There was a conversation, reported by two separate sources with knowledge of the household, that happened between Charles and Edward in the private sitting room at Sandringham in the late autumn of 2024. No aides were present. No notes were taken in any form that has since been produced, but both men spoke about it afterwards to people close to them, and the version that has emerged from those conversations has a consistency that suggests it is substantially accurate. Charles told Edward that he needed him to stop thinking of himself as the youngest and start thinking of himself as the one who holds it together. He said the institution was going through a contraction that was necessary and overdue, and that a smaller monarchy needs every person in it to carry more than they were asked to carry before. And then he said something that people close to Edward have repeated more than once since. He told him that their mother always knew what he was capable of. She simply never had the occasion to ask him to prove it. Edward did not respond immediately. He has never been the one who responds immediately. He sat with it, the way he sits with things, which is quietly, and for a long time. And then he said he understood what was being asked of him. And he said he had been ready for it, for longer than anyone in that building had bothered to notice. Now I need to tell you about William, because William's response to this is the part of the story that nobody inside the palace is discussing in full sentences. William has spent years building a very specific vision of what the monarchy becomes when it is his. Fewer working royals, tighter control over who represents the crown and under what conditions, a slimmed-down institution with a clear operational center and no ambiguity about where the authority sits. He has said versions of this in public. He has implemented versions of it in private. The removal of extended family members from working royal duties, the restructuring of the household, the consolidation of decision-making inside his own office. Every one of those moves points toward the same destination, which is a monarchy where the lines of authority are clear and documented and accountable in a way the institution has historically resisted. And then his father signed a document that expanded his youngest uncle's operational powers in ways that William had not been fully briefed on before it happened. Palace sources have described William's initial reaction as contained, which, in the language of that household, is a specific thing. It does not mean calm. It means controlled. It means the face was still while the calculation was running underneath it. It means the future king sat with new information that had not been routed through his office and worked out what it meant before he said a single word about it to anybody. What he said, when he did say it, was measured and precise in the way that William is always measured and precise when he is most serious. He told his office that any expansion of formal royal duties needed to be coordinated with his office going forward. Not requested, not suggested, told. And the distinction between those two things is the whole story of where the power in that building actually lives right now. He is not opposed to Edward. That is the important clarity here, and it matters. Sources close to William have been careful to separate the two questions, which are whether Edward is the right person for an expanded role, and whether the process by which that role was expanded respected the operational structure William has been building. The answer to the first question, from William's side, is yes. The answer to the second is more complicated, and it is the conversation that is still moving inside that family right now. Because William trusts Edward. In the context of the slimmed-down monarchy he is building, a senior working royal with Edward's longevity, Sophie's political instincts, and 30 years of institutional knowledge is genuinely valuable. Edward knows where everything is. He has attended more working engagements than most people in that building will manage in a lifetime, for less recognition and with more consistency than almost anyone except Anne. He is not a risk. He is an asset. What William is working through is not whether to use that asset. It is whether his father's method of deploying it created a precedent for how decisions get made about the operational structure of the institution, and a precedent that bypasses the future king's office is not a precedent William is willing to absorb without comment. Now let me take you to the fallout, because there are 3 people whose reactions to this document tell you almost everything about where this family stands right now. The first is Princess Anne. Anne has watched Edward from the position of the sibling who has always worked hardest and cared least about how the structure of that work was formally documented. She has never asked for a title to match her output. She has never pushed for a constitutional clarification of her role. She does the work because the work needs doing, and she is the one willing to do it. And she has operated on that basis for 50 years without complaint and without a document to prove it. Her reaction to Edward's formalization was therefore complicated in a way that had nothing to do with any objection to Edward personally. It had to do with what it says about an institution that spent decades taking her output for granted and has now produced a formal legal document to clarify the output of someone who arrived at his current level of productivity considerably more recently. People close to Anne have described her response as dry, which from Anne is as close to a pointed observation as you will ever get in a room that does not have press in it. The second is Andrew, and this one is simpler. Andrew is gone from the working royal structure in every sense that matters operationally. He lives at Royal Lodge in a situation that is somewhere between a retirement and a holding pattern, fighting a battle over a building that he is slowly and methodically losing. He has no patronages, no official duties, no access to the briefing documents that tell you where the institution is going. He is constitutionally present in the succession and operationally invisible in everything else. And the formalization of Edward's expanded role is a document that makes that contrast official in a way that no single previous decision quite managed to do. 2 sons of Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. One of them now holds the title and the formal operational standing that goes with it. The other is arguing with the Crown Estate about a grace and favor property in Windsor. The institution has not commented on that contrast publicly. It does not need to. The document does the commenting for it. The third reaction is the one that nobody was supposed to hear about at all, and it came from California. Harry and Meghan were not consulted about the document. They were not informed in advance. They found out the way they have found out about everything in the last 4 years, which is from the same places the rest of us find out. And by every account that has reached the British press, The specific detail that landed hardest was not the expansion of Edward's role itself. It was the constitutional language in the document regarding the formal duties of counselors of state, because that language touches directly on the question that has been sitting unresolved since Harry and Meghan stepped back in 2020. Whether Harry retains the formal standing to act as a counselor of state, whether the institution he left is still carrying him in its operational framework in a way that is now being explicitly clarified for the uncle who stayed. One source described the atmosphere in that household after the news reached them as unhappy, which is a word that covers a great deal of ground in the context of those two people and that institution. Harry is still formally a counselor of state. The law has not removed him. But the document around Edward makes the contrast between formal inclusion and operational relevance so visible that it functions as a kind of answer to questions Harry has been asking, indirectly and through intermediaries, for several years. The answer is that the institution has moved on. Edward has been formalized into the structure. William is consolidating around him, and the space that Harry left has been filled by someone who was always there and simply never got the paperwork until now. There is one last piece of this, and it is the one I have been holding since the beginning. The afternoon the document was finalized, there was a small gathering of the people who had worked on it. Not a ceremony, not a reception. A handful of senior household officials and legal advisors in a room off the main corridor of the palace, doing the kind of quiet administrative confirmation that follows a constitutional instrument being signed. No cameras, no statement prepared. The press office was not in the building. Edward was there. Sophie was beside him, the way she is always beside him, not performing anything, just present. And one of the senior advisors, a man who has spent 30 years working in royal constitutional law and who has seen documents like this come through his office before, said something to Edward as the room was preparing to clear. He said that this was the moment the institution had been waiting for the right person in the right position with the right documentation behind him. He said he hoped Edward understood the weight of what had just been placed on his shoulders. Edward looked at him for a moment. He looked at the document on the table. He looked at Sophie. And then he said something quietly, in the particular tone of a person who has been carrying a sentence for a long time and has finally found the right room to say it in. He said he had always known it would come. 5 words. Not triumphant, not emotional. Said the way you say something that has been true for so long that it stopped being a hope and became simply a fact you were waiting for the institution to catch up with. The advisor who heard it has repeated it to 2 people since. Both of them have said the same thing independently, that those 5 words said more about Edward's 30-year journey through that family than any official biography, any palace statement, any documentary the BBC has ever produced about the younger royals. He had always known it would come, not in bitterness, not in the voice of a man who felt he had been wronged and was owed a reckoning, in the voice of somebody who had simply decided very early on that he would be ready whenever the institution was. And then he had spent 30 years being exactly that, ready while the institution looked elsewhere and the cameras pointed at his siblings, and the headlines found more interesting things to say about other people. He was the 4th child. He was the one who quit. He was the one nobody watched. And now his name is on a constitutional document that will sit in the official record of this monarchy for the rest of its existence. The man nobody watched just became the person the monarchy cannot function without. And somewhere in Windsor tonight, in a building full of people managing their positions and watching each other's moves and calculating what the next 12 months look like for their own office, A quiet man who has been waiting since 1987 is sitting with his wife and the knowledge that the